Let's take a trip back in time to the Roman Colosseum, a giant arena where things were far from fair, and the audience didn't care about who fought better. They came to see blood, drama, and wild entertainment. This place wasn't about sportsmanship or skill. It was built for huge spectacles where fairness wasn't even considered. The Colosseum wasn't a place where you went to cheer on your favorite team. It was where you went to forget your problems and watch someone else suffer, often in the most over-the-top ways possible. If you were expecting balance, like a match between two evenly skilled fighters, you'd be disappointed. People didn't come to see a fair fight, they came to watch someone fall in the most dramatic way. Think of flailing arms, loud screams, and exaggerated facial expressions. That's what the crowd loved. A trained duel might happen now and then, but most of the time, the opening acts involved prisoners, criminals, or unlucky folks who had upset the wrong senator. These people were handed cheap weapons like a broken sword or a wooden stick and told to make it look exciting. And they did. The Colosseum wasn't just a place to watch fights. It was almost like therapy for the citizens of Rome. Life in ancient Rome was stressful. Disease, food shortages, fires. Watching someone else have a terrible day helped people feel better about their own lives. It was free entertainment, funded by the emperor, who used it as a way to stay popular. If he gave you free grain and a front row seat to a man being chased by a rhino, you were more likely to like him or at least not start a riot. Even the seating arrangement in the Colosseum showed how unfair things were. The emperor had the best seat, in the shade with cushions. Senators had soft benches. Everyone else had stone seats and sunburns. The fighters, of course, were stuck in the arena, trying not to die. If you were chosen to fight and had no training, it didn't matter. The Romans had no problem throwing regular people, bakers, farmers, even office workers into the arena against professional gladiators. These matches between skilled gladiators and helpless civilians weren't accidents. They were planned. Sometimes the civilians were volunteers. Sometimes they were criminals. Sometimes they were just people who didn't read the small print on a contract. Gladiators weren't all slaves, either. Some were famous athletes, and all of them were well trained. They had coaches, lived in special schools, and were treated like deadly sports stars. So imagine being a regular person who watched a few sword fights and shadow puppets, suddenly asked to fight one of these professionals. The result was always predictable: the gladiator won. But that was the point. It wasn't about who would win. It was about giving the crowd something to laugh, cheer, or gasp about. The audience knew the amateur would lose. The amateur knew it. Even the guy cleaning the sand probably knew it. Still, there were ways to win the crowd. If you lasted long enough without dying, or if you got hit in a funny way, the crowd might find you charming. If you tripped and landed in a net, the audience might laugh so hard that the emperor gave you mercy. Romans loved a good underdog story, especially when covered in a little bit of blood. But let's be honest, most of the time, the loser was doomed from the start. Now imagine you were accused of a crime. Maybe you stole something. Maybe you offended someone powerful. Maybe you just had a neighbor who didn't like you. Suddenly, you were chosen to appear in the Colosseum, and not in a fun way. You were thrown in with hungry lions. This was called damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts. It was Rome's way of saying, let's mix crime and punishment with wild animals. The lions used weren't your average cats. They were massive, powerful, and usually imported from places like North Africa. They were treated like star performers. They got better transportation and sometimes better meals than the average citizen. The criminal, meanwhile, got a simple tunic and maybe a stick, not a sword. Not armor, just a stick. That's how fair it was. And the goal wasn't survival, it was entertainment. These events weren't meant to be fights. They were messages. Rome didn't just punish people, it turned them into public shows. The worse your final moments were, the more the crowd cheered. And yes, parents brought their kids to watch. It was like a violent history lesson. Don't steal, or you'll get eaten. Sometimes, prisoners surprised everyone. They ran away, dodged attacks, or climbed things. There's even a story about a man who pretended to be dead so well that the lion lost interest. Sadly, the audience didn't. They made sure the show continued. To the Romans, the idea of getting rid of the lions would have ruined the fun. Once the lion show was over, it was time for something new. The next act involved armed people fighting animals in strange setups. These were called Venationi's staged hunts. The arena was turned into a fake forest, complete with sand, trees, and bushes. Then animals like leopards, bears, ostriches, and even crocodiles were released. Sometimes trained hunters were used, but other times it was just random guys with deaths and bad luck. They were handed weapons like nets or sticks and told to put on a good show. It wasn't really a hunt. It was survival mixed with confusion. Sometimes the animals were drugged or starved. Other times, they were just terrified and ran in every direction. The point was never a fair fight. It was how dramatic the moment was. If a rhino flipped a man into the air like a toy, the crowd cheered. If the man won, they cheered louder. There were even times when animals ignored the humans and fought each other. One story tells of a bear and a lion who started their own match. The audience loved it. The organizers probably got a raise. It wasn't hunting, it was chaos. Rome was rich, bored, and always looking for new ways to shock people. When things started getting predictable, Rome raised the stakes. They created a new kind of execution called fatal charades. These were myths turned into public deaths. Instead of quietly executing someone, they dressed them up as characters from stories and made them act it out before dying. Imagine a man dressed as Icarus with fake wings being pushed off a platform. No, he didn't fly. Or another dressed as Prometheus being attacked by a real eagle. There was even a version of Orpheus, where a man with a harp walked across the arena until animals were released and ended the story early. These weren't plays. These weren't actors. These were people being punished, turned into live myths for the crowd to enjoy. The stories were rarely accurate. Nobody cared if Hercules actually lost a foot in the real myth. What mattered was that it looked cool and kept people clapping. The crowd felt like they were watching culture even though it was really just theater mixed with terror. And if the emperor nodded at the end, the crowd cheered louder. Then came the naval battles. Yes, Rome decided to flood the Colosseum and put boats inside. These fake sea battles, called naumachii, were the ancient version of water shows, except people actually died. The engineers filled the arena with water, brought in small ships, and forced people to reenact famous sea fights. Most of the participants had no idea how to row or swim. They were captives told to paddle, fight, and hope they didn't fall in. The boats were painted, decorated, and fully armed. The crowd didn't care about tactics. They just wanted to see someone fall in with a scream. And they often got their wish. Sometimes ships crashed, fighters jumped between boats, or accidentally stabbed their own teammates. It was more like chaotic water theater than an actual battle. Eventually, the Colosseum stopped these water shows. Water and ancient concrete didn't mix well, but for a while, Romans enjoyed sea fights in a building miles away from any coast. So, you've seen the lions and sea battles. What's next? Well, just when you think the Roman Colosseum couldn't get any more over the top, the organizers pulled out even crazier ideas. They started adding gimmicks to the fights, weird rules, surprise twists, and wild animals that had nothing to do with the match. Why? Because Romans didn't like boring. If something was predictable, they wanted it changed. So they made sure every match had something strange. One popular trick was to blindfold a fighter. Imagine walking into the arena with thousands of people watching, and you can't even see. That was real. They'd take a skilled fighter and make him fight without sight. Or they'd chain his hands or feet, or both. Some were even tied to their opponent, so that if one fell, the other did too. It was like a deadly version of the three-legged race. It didn't make the fight better, just more ridiculous. And the crowd loved it. Sometimes, fighters were given terrible weapons. One guy might get a sword, the other, a wooden stick. Some unlucky ones were handed nets, as if they were catching fish, not fighting for their lives. Other times, someone got a weapon but no armor. The more awkward the setup, the more the crowd cheered. It was like they were watching a deadly game show, and the rules were made up on the spot. And just when a fighter thought he understood the plan, the floor might open up literally. The Colosseum had a hidden network of tunnels and trapdoors. From beneath the sand, stagehands could raise animals, props, or even entire set pieces. Imagine you're about to win a fight, and suddenly a bear pops out of the floor. Surprise! You're not done yet. These surprise attacks weren't accidents. The people running the show planned them carefully. Behind the scenes were slaves and workers pulling levers, opening doors, and making sure the chaos happened exactly on time. Sometimes they messed up. A lion might appear too early or too late, and the fight would get awkward. But usually, the timing was perfect, adding extra danger to every match. They didn't stop at animals either. Sometimes they rolled out fire, pits, or massive wooden props. They might build a fake volcano or a creepy version of the underworld. This turned the Colosseum into something more like a theater, but instead of actors, it was real people fighting for their lives, and maybe tripping over a fake rock while doing it. One of the most popular match types was Gladiator vs. Gladiator. On the surface, it sounds like the fairest kind of fight. Two trained warriors, evenly matched, going head to head. But in reality, even these fights were often rigged. One gladiator might be an experienced pro. The other might be a rookie who just got out of training school. It wasn't always fair, but it was exciting. There were also mismatched fighting styles. One type of gladiator, the secutor, wore heavy armor and carried a sword and shield. His opponent, the retiarius, had a net, a trident, and almost no armor. He had to rely on speed and luck. These fights were like watching a tank go up against a fisherman. But the crowd loved the contrast. It made the fights more dramatic. Sometimes, the more popular gladiators got easier fights on purpose. If someone had a big fan base, the organizers didn't want them to lose, so they gave them weak opponents, just to make them look even better. These star gladiators were treated like celebrities. People carved their faces on cups and wore jewelry with their images. Kids pretended to be them in games, and fans rooted for them like modern sports stars. Gladiators weren't just fighters, they were part of the empire's image. If a gladiator was winning often, he became a symbol of Rome's strength. But if he got too popular, he became a risk. What if he refused to die? What if the crowd liked him more than the emperor? Sometimes the empire had to quietly remove a popular gladiator before he caused problems. The emperor himself played a huge role in the games. He sat in the best seat, with the best view, under a shady canopy. The crowd didn't just watch the fight, they watched the emperor watch the fight. His reaction could change everything. If the loser of a match had fought bravely, the emperor might choose to spare him, or not. It depended on how he felt and on the mood of the audience. You've probably heard the idea of thumbs down, meaning death. But here's the twist. Nobody is really sure what the thumbs meant. Some historians say thumbs up meant death, like a sword pointing up. Others say thumbs down meant mercy, and some believe the whole thing was more like vague hand-waving. Whatever the case, the emperor and the crowd had the final say. That's right, the crowd got to vote. After a match, the loser's fate was decided by the roar of the people. If they cheered for mercy, he might live. If they booed, he was likely a goner. It was like ancient Yelp, but louder and more dangerous. And yes, the fighters knew how to work the crowd. They played to the audience, showed off, and tried to be entertaining. If you were boring, the crowd went silent, and that was worse than being booed. Some gladiators had fan clubs. People followed their careers, supported them, and cheered for them at every match. Even emperors couldn't ignore public opinion. If the audience wanted mercy, it was a smart move to agree. But if they wanted blood, well, someone was about to have a very bad day. And there were surprises. A fight might seem over, and then boom, a trapdoor opens, and a second opponent appears. Or even worse, an animal. Imagine a man fighting a person, and suddenly a bear joins the match. The Romans loved this kind of chaos. It was like live action entertainment with no rules and lots of surprises. You might think the audience got a break between matches, a chance to stretch, grab some food, or chat about their favorite gladiator. And yes, there was an intermission. But the Romans didn't use that time for rest. They used it for executions. During lunchtime, the games paused for a while, but instead of silence, the crowd got a special kind of show. This part of the day was called the Meridiani, and it featured public executions. Criminals, deserters, or people who annoyed the wrong official were brought out and killed in front of everyone. This wasn't a fight, it was a message. The empire wanted you to know what happened to lawbreakers, and they made sure you saw it up close. The methods used were often over the top. Sometimes it was quick and simple, other times it was long and dramatic, especially if the person had done something that made headlines. Executions were planned, rehearsed, and delivered like stage plays. You could be executed for stealing, protesting, or just being unlucky. The crowd got used to it. Merchants still walked around selling snacks. Kids asked their parents if they could move closer. Some people even got annoyed if the executions took too long. Hurry up, someone might say. We're here for the real fights. These deaths weren't the main event, they were just the warm-up. That's what made the whole thing so strange. To the Roman crowd, executions weren't shocking, they were filler. Like commercials between the good parts of a show. Only instead of advertising products, they advertised fear. Don't make trouble, or you could be next. And that was the point. The Colosseum wasn't just about fun. It was about power. Every event, every fight, every death was carefully planned to remind people who was in charge. The emperor didn't just rule with laws. He ruled with shows that distracted you, dazzled you, and warned you not to step out of line. In modern sports, referees make the rules. In the Roman Colosseum, the audience made the rules with their voices, their cheers, and their votes. It was loud, chaotic, and dangerous. But for the people of Rome, it was the best show in town. Now, let's talk about some of the most unexpected and bizarre parts of the Roman Colosseum. You might think the wildest fights involved lions or chariots, but there were other surprises, too. One of the strangest and most unexpectedly dangerous animals brought into the arena was the pig. Yes, the wild boar. Not the kind you roast at a feast, but the kind that charges like a battering ram with tusks. To the Romans, pigs weren't just food. Wild boars were part of the entertainment. They were strong, fast, and angry. Imagine a pig the size of a small horse running straight at someone, ready to knock them off their feet, all while thousands of people cheered. It was funny to the crowd, but deadly serious for the person in the arena. Even trained gladiators struggled with boars. These animals weren't part of the usual training, and they often moved unpredictably. Boars appeared in animal hunts and sometimes as surprise guests during other fights. Picture two gladiators locked in battle, when suddenly, gate opens and out runs a furious pig. That's Roman creativity for you. In one story, a boar charged through the set, ignored its handlers, and almost ran into the front row. The crowd loved it. There's nothing quite like a 300-pound pig interrupting your afternoon. Romans didn't just want violence. They wanted unpredictability. A lion was majestic, a tiger was terrifying, but a boar? That was chaos. And chaos made the audience laugh, especially when the fighters underestimated the danger. Sometimes even emperors showed off their exotic pigs to prove how powerful their empire was. After all, nothing says wealth like being able to send angry bacon after your enemies. Now, underneath all this craziness was the hidden world of the Colosseum, a maze of tunnels, cages, and machines below the arena floor. This was where the real magic happened. The Romans didn't just rely on sword fights. They engineered surprises. Trapdoors could open at any moment. Lifts could raise animals, chariots, or props into the arena, all with perfect timing. Imagine being a gladiator who's about to win, when suddenly boom, the floor splits open and a leopard appears. That was not an accident. It was planned. The workers below the arena, mostly slaves and laborers, controlled these machines. They had to be incredibly precise. One mistake, and the wrong animal could appear at the wrong time, or worse, not show up at all. They also used stage effects, Sometimes they'd roll out fire pits. Other times, massive wooden structures appeared to represent scenes from mythology, a fake underworld, a mountain, or even a volcano. These setups turned the fight into a kind of live action story. The gladiators weren't just fighters anymore, they were part of a show. All of this was designed to keep the audience entertained. It wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about surprising the crowd, keeping them engaged, and giving them something to talk about. In the Colosseum, the enemy wasn't just your opponent, it was the floor, the animals, and whatever the organizers thought would make things interesting. The people running these shows were basically event planners. Their job was to make sure everything was dramatic, dangerous, and perfectly timed. If a fire pit didn't light or an animal didn't appear, it ruined the scene. These planners had to manage chaos like a circus, but with more weapons and less safety. So, let's say you're watching a fight, maybe two gladiators, maybe a man versus a bear. Just when things get good, you notice something else happening. The floor begins to move. A chariot rolls out. Suddenly, it's not just a fight, it's a full-blown stage play. That's what the Colosseum became, a theater of violence, where the story could change in an instant, and where the crowd never knew what would happen next. Even the so-called fair fights weren't always fair. Gladiator versus gladiator matches were often unequal. One fighter might be highly trained, strong, and experienced. The other might be a rookie or recovering from an injury. The weapons were sometimes mismatched too. One might have a sword and shield, while the other had a net and a trident. These odd matchups had names. One of the most popular was the Secutor, a heavily armored fighter versus the Retiarius, a nearly naked guy with a net and a three-pronged spear. It was strength and armor versus speed and luck. The crowd loved this kind of contrast. It was like pitting a tank against a ninja. Why did they do this? Because sameness was boring. If two guys with swords fought each other, people got tired quickly. But if one fighter looked like a human turtle and the other like a fish wrangler, that was fun to watch. It wasn't always about balance. It was about excitement. Sometimes the popular gladiators, the ones with fans and reputations, were set up to win. They were investments. These guys brought in money and attention. If one of them was on a winning streak, the organizers didn't want that to stop. So they gave them easier fights just to keep the legend going. These famous gladiators had fans who were carvings of them, drew pictures of them, and talked about them like we talk about athletes today. They were celebrities. Kids pretended to be them, adults bet on them, and the empire used them for political purposes too. A strong, popular gladiator made Rome look good, but that fame could be dangerous. If a gladiator became too loved by the people, he might be seen as a threat. What if the crowd started cheering for him instead of the emperor? What if he refused to die? Suddenly, he wasn't just a fighter, he was a symbol. And symbols were powerful. The empire had to keep that in check. Sometimes, the emperor got involved directly. He might overrule the crowd's vote, either granting mercy or demanding death. His decision was final, and people paid close attention. If the emperor laughed at a fall, everyone else did too. If he frowned during a match, the whole mood changed. The emperor's opinion was the biggest thumbs up or thumbs down of all. There was no rulebook in the Colosseum, just a few basic questions. Is this entertaining? Is it shocking? Will the audience keep watching? If the answer was yes, then anything was allowed, even if it meant changing the rules mid-match or opening a trapdoor with a surprise lion. The truth is, the Colosseum wasn't really a sports arena. It was a place for public storytelling through blood, violence, and surprise. The Romans didn't need scripts. They had sand, weapons, and imagination. Every match was a chance to tell a story, sometimes a comedy, sometimes a tragedy, with real people and real consequences. And the people kept coming back. They laughed, they cheered, they cried out for mercy or revenge. The Colosseum didn't just give them entertainment. It gave them something to believe in, even if what they believed in was unpredictable, unfair, and covered in sand and blood. By now, It's clear that the Roman Colosseum wasn't just about fighting, it was about putting on a big, messy, violent show. But it wasn't only about giving the crowd a good time. It was also a giant public message. Every animal, every sword swing, every death. They all told the audience the same thing: Rome is in charge. The emperor is watching. And if you step out of line, you'll be next. The Colosseum wasn't just for fun, it was a stage for politics. Emperors used the games to send messages. Did taxes just go up? Host a week of fights. Did a senator criticize the emperor? Throw someone into the arena dressed like that? Senator. Was there a military victory? Recreate the battle in the sand, with real weapons and real deaths. It was like a deadly version of a press conference, where instead of giving a speech, you tossed a man in front of a tiger. Even foreign visitors were treated to these events. If a powerful leader from another country came to visit Rome, what better way to impress him than with a fight between gladiators and lions? Maybe throw in a few bears for fun. Nothing said, "Welcome to Rome," like someone being flipped through the air by a rhino. And when things weren't going well, say the empire was short on money, or the people were angry, the emperor used the games to distract everyone. It worked. Give the people bread and a good show, and they'd forget about their empty stomachs or their broken roads. It was a trick that worked for centuries. But even the most dramatic shows couldn't go on forever. Over time, things started to change. The fights got smaller. The animals became harder to find. People started to lose interest. The Colosseum, once the center of Rome's social life, began to feel like old news. Even the greatest shows wear out eventually. Still, for many years, the Roman people were obsessed with spectacle. They craved it. The Colosseum gave them something to believe in. Whether they were rich or poor, young or old, they could sit together and watch someone try to survive. It was brutal, but it brought people together. In some strange way, it made the empire feel united. That's why the Colosseum stayed open for so long. It wasn't just a place to see fights, it was where people connected, where citizens forgot their problems, where the emperor gained support or scared his enemies. It was entertainment, therapy, and politics all in one. Let's talk about the crowd for a moment. These people weren't quiet observers. They were loud, emotional, and very involved. They shouted advice at the fighters. They laughed when someone fell. They booed if a match got boring. And they cheered so hard that their voices could decide who lived or died. This wasn't just a small audience either. The Colosseum could hold around 50,000 people. Imagine that. A massive, roaring sea of Romans yelling for blood or mercy. It was like being in a giant concert where the main event was life or death. And remember the famous thumbs down gesture? It's actually a little more complicated. Historians now think we may have gotten it wrong. In movies, thumbs down means death. But in ancient Rome, some believed that a thumbs up meant kill him, like drawing a sword. Others think it was all more symbolic, not just thumbs, but gestures or shouts. Either way, the crowd had power. If they liked a gladiator, they might scream for mercy. If they were bored or angry, they might call for blood. Some gladiators became experts at playing to the audience. They'd strike a dramatic pose, raise their arms, or drag out a fight to get more cheers. In fact, some fighters became so famous that people made carvings of them. Not official merchandise, but fan-made statues, necklaces, or graffiti. Some gladiators had nicknames, signature moves, and followers who tracked their careers. If one of them lost, people talked about it like a modern sports upset. But even the most popular gladiators were at risk. If the emperor was in a bad mood, or if the crowd turned on them, fame didn't matter. One bad performance, one unpopular decision, and it could all end with a single hand gesture. That's how much pressure was in the arena. And remember, the emperor had the final say. If he wanted someone dead, they died no matter what the crowd said. If he wanted someone spared, even the angriest mob couldn't change his mind. Sometimes emperors gave mercy just to seem generous. Other times, they ordered death to show power. Either way, everyone was watching. The emperor's role in the games was huge. He sat right in the middle, in a shaded seat, with the best view. People watched him as closely as they watched the fight. If he laughed, they laughed. If he scowled, they got quiet. His reaction was like a review of the performance, and emperors used this attention to their advantage. They could win support by hosting huge games, giving away food, or pardoning a fighter. It was like being a celebrity, a politician, and a judge all at once. And all it took was a nod, a smile, or a simple hand motion to make or break someone's fate. But not every gladiator match ended in death. Sometimes, if a fighter lost but had fought bravely, he was spared. Maybe he had fans. Maybe he got lucky. Maybe he made the emperor laugh. It was still a risk, but not every fight was a death sentence. The crowd played a big part, but survival often came down to timing, performance, and public mood. Even silence was a decision. If the crowd didn't cheer or boo, if they just stayed quiet, that was the worst sign. It meant the fighter was boring, and boring didn't survive in Rome. Gladiators had to be warriors, actors, and sometimes even comedians just to stay alive. Sometimes, fights had unexpected endings. A fighter might trip and make the whole crowd laugh, or he might pull off a surprising move and win against the odds. These moments were legendary. They were the stories people told over and over. That's what made the Colosseum special. Anything could happen, and it didn't stop with people. Animals were stars too. Lions, tigers, elephants, bears, they were treated like performers. They traveled better than some citizens. And when they did something surprising, like team up or ignore the humans completely, the crowd went wild. Once, a bear and a lion started fighting each other instead of the humans. The audience loved it. The man who organized it probably got a promotion. There were even themed events. Sometimes the shows were based on mythology. A prisoner might be dressed like a character from a famous story like Icarus, who tried to fly. They'd put him in fake wings and push him off a platform. It was storytelling Roman style. Violent, dramatic, and unforgettable. These myth-based shows were called fatal charades. They weren't plays. The actors were people being punished, and the ending was always death. The Romans thought they were mixing art with justice, but really, they were turning executions into entertainment. The crowd pretended they were learning about legends, but mostly, they were watching someone die in costume. It was theater with blood, a strange mix of education and violence that only Rome could invent. Just when the Romans seemed to have done it all in the Colosseum, fights, animals, myths, they asked, what if we filled it with water? And that's exactly what they did. In the early years of the Colosseum, Rome staged mock naval battles, called naumachii. They actually flooded the arena floor, tossed in ships, and made people reenact sea wars all in the middle of a giant stone stadium. It wasn't close to the ocean. The Colosseum was on land, but Roman engineers were brilliant and had a lot of free time. They figured out how to flood the arena using underground plumbing. Then they launched small ships, not full warships, but still impressive, and let the chaos begin. The people rowing these boats were often prisoners or enslaved captives who didn't know how to row, let alone fight on water. They were told to act like real sailors, use real weapons, and try not to drown. Some battles were meant to copy famous Roman victories. Others were just made up for fun. Either way, it didn't matter to the audience. They weren't watching for historical accuracy. They were watching to see who would fall in the water, who would scream the loudest, and whether anyone got hit with an oar. The boats were decorated with paint and flags, and sometimes the battles got really dramatic, ships colliding, people jumping from deck to deck, or accidentally hitting their own teammates. It was more like floating chaos than a real battle. Imagine watching people who had never seen a boat try to sail one. Now, add weapons and a crowd of 50,000 cheering them on. Eventually, the Colosseum stopped doing these water battles. Ancient concrete and water didn't get along, and keeping the structure from collapsing became more important than watching people splash around. But for a while, Romans got to see floating fights in the middle of a stadium. Even if the sailors couldn't row and half of them couldn't swim, it was still a big hit. Now, let's talk about one of Rome's favorite things: gimmicks. Romans loved taking a normal fight and making it weirder. The organizers added blindfolds, chains, ridiculous weapons, and even surprise animals, all to keep things entertaining. Sometimes a skilled gladiator was purposely given a disadvantage. Maybe his sword was replaced with a wooden stick. Maybe his armor was taken away. Or maybe he was forced to fight blindfolded, while the other fighter had full gear. It wasn't about fairness, it was about fun. The crowd didn't want to see a clean match. They wanted to see someone struggle and either survive or fail in an epic way. In some fights, two people were chained together wrist to wrist, ankle to ankle. If one fell, the other did too. It was like the deadliest three-legged race in history. The crowd laughed when they stumbled, gasped when they fought back to back, and cheered when one dragged the other around the arena. These crazy matchups weren't used on all fighters. Gladiators were valuable. They cost money, needed training, and were like celebrities. The more famous they were, the less likely they were to be given stupid weapons or tied to someone. But if the crowd was bored or the emperor wanted to laugh, even the best gladiators could find themselves in a silly and dangerous setup. And just when fighters thought they had seen it all, the organizers added surprise opponents. You might think you're fighting one man, then, boom, a trapdoor opens, and now you're facing two. Or worse, a bear. Yes, Romans sometimes dropped animals into the fight without warning. It was like a gladiator version of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, but with claws and teeth. None of this was in a rulebook. There was no rulebook. There was only one goal: make the crowd excited. If something was entertaining, it stayed. If it was boring, it was gone. Even cleaning the blood between fights had to be done fast, so the next show could begin without delay. You might think that between all the blood and chaos, the audience would need a break. Technically, there was a midday intermission, but this wasn't a time for rest or snacks. It was time for public executions. The Romans called it the Meridiani, and it was used to show justice loudly and dramatically. These executions weren't random. They were planned, scheduled, and performed in front of everyone. Criminals, deserters, or anyone who angered the wrong person could end up being executed in the middle of the arena. There was no trial at this point. The decision was already made. Now, it was about how it would be done and how many people would watch. Sometimes the execution was quick. Other times it was made into a show, long, drawn out, and theatrical. The crowd didn't see this as weird. It was just part of the day. Kids watched while eating snacks. Vendors walked around selling food. If the execution ran long, people got annoyed because it delayed the gladiator matches. To them, executions were filler like commercials between their favorite scenes. But for the empire, these public punishments were important. They reminded everyone who was in charge: don't steal, don't lie, don't betray, or this could be you. Even during lunchtime, the Colosseum was sending a message: Rome has power, and it doesn't forgive easily. These shows also gave the people a feeling of control. When the crowd screamed for death or mercy, it mattered. Their voices, their hands, their noise could decide a man's fate. It was a strange kind of democracy, one based on blood and shouting. But to the Romans, it made sense, and sometimes that power went to their heads. People booed if a fight was boring. They cheered when someone slipped. They even made up chants and nicknames for their favorite fighters. If someone became popular enough, the emperor might even let them live. Not out of kindness, but because the crowd demanded it. But the emperor could also take that power back in an instant. With a single hand gesture, he could silence the crowd and decide life or death. His reactions became part of the show. Everyone watched him, waited for him to smile or nod, and when he did, it could mean mercy or the end. The emperor's image was shaped by the games. If he gave away food, spared fighters, or hosted giant festivals, the people liked him. If he raised taxes and cut the games short, they turned on him. Some emperors used the games to stay popular. Others used them to scare people. Either way, it worked. In some cases, even the theme of the games was political. A battle victory, reenact it with prisoners. A holiday, celebrate with wild animals and parades. A foreign guest visiting, show him a fight to prove how strong Rome is. Everything was part of the message. Rome is powerful, Rome is wealthy, and Rome doesn't mess around. the Colosseum was more than a place for fun. It was the empire's biggest stage, a place where history, politics, and entertainment collided. Every drop of blood, every cheer, every fallen gladiator was part of a bigger story, one about power, control, and the empire that demanded both. By now, you've seen how wild, unfair, and creative the Roman Colosseum could be. But here's the big question. Why did it all keep going for so long? Why did the empire keep putting on games with so much violence, chaos, and drama year after year? The answer is simple. The people loved it. Rome was addicted to spectacle. These weren't just shows. They were part of everyday life. The games were political tools, public therapy, national pride, and a way to forget your problems all rolled into one. They made Rome feel alive. The empire was huge, complicated, and always on the edge of trouble. There were wars, tax problems, food shortages, and endless political arguments. But if you gave the people a seat in the Colosseum, a piece of bread, and something to cheer or scream about, suddenly, life didn't seem so bad. That was the genius of it. It was distraction that felt like celebration. It was also incredibly effective. Let's say the emperor just raised taxes. People are upset. What does he do? Hosts a week-long festival of games. Suddenly, everyone's too busy watching someone wrestle a lion to complain about their tax bill. Or maybe the emperor insulted the Senate. He could win them back by releasing flaming chariots, putting on a naval battle, or giving out free food during the games. It worked nearly every time, and it wasn't just about politics. It was also about emotions. Life in Rome could be hard, especially if you were poor. But the Colosseum gave people something to look forward to, something to talk about, something to make them feel like they were part of something bigger. In a city filled with problems, the games made people feel like they belonged. The Colosseum became Rome's original social media. Think about it. Constant updates, constant drama, and public reactions that mattered. A fighter gets cheered, he becomes a hero. A prisoner makes the crowd laugh before dying, he becomes a legend. There was no comment section, but you didn't need one. People spoke with their hands, their voices, and their food. A loud cheer meant approval. Silence, that was a downvote. Some emperors used the games to shape their entire public image. They threw lavish festivals with fireworks, yes, real ones, exotic animals, and actors who performed in deadly reenactments. If something dramatic happened in the games, like a fighter refusing to kill his opponent, the story spread fast. Before long, everyone in Rome was talking about it. That's why the games were so carefully planned. Every moment mattered. Every entrance, every animal, every sword swing. There were teams of planners, engineers, artists, and laborers making sure everything ran smoothly. The shows weren't thrown together. They were choreographed down to the last detail. Even blood on the sand had to be cleaned up fast, so the next scene could begin. And still, despite all the planning, surprises were what made the Colosseum truly exciting. The crowd didn't just want blood. They wanted twists. A trapdoor opening unexpectedly, a fighter turning the tables, a lion refusing to attack. These moments became part of Rome's shared memory, something people would retell for years. Of course, not everyone approved. There were thinkers and philosophers who thought the games were cruel, wasteful, and damaging to society. But they were a minority. Most people saw the games as a part of Roman identity, a piece of culture they were proud of, even if it was violent. Over time, though, things started to change. The empire began to slow down. Resources ran low. Animals became harder to find and more expensive to import. Crowds began to expect more than even Rome could deliver. And slowly, the games began to lose their magic. At first, the events just got smaller. Fewer animals, fewer ships, fewer wild surprises. But eventually, as Rome faced bigger problems, invasions, collapsing government, and a crumbling economy, in the Colosseum couldn't distract people anymore. The shows that once brought the whole city together began to feel like a thing of the past. But the memory of those games didn't fade. The Colosseum itself remained standing, even when it stopped being used. It became a monument to Rome's incredible, and sometimes terrifying ability to put on a show. Tourists came from all over to see it. And even today, it's one of the most famous buildings in the world. People don't remember it as just a sports arena. They remember it as a symbol of how far a civilization will go to entertain, control, and inspire its people. Because the Colosseum wasn't just about killing, it was about power, about fear, about loyalty, and about making history, one dramatic fall at a time. There's something haunting about it. When you walk through the ruins today, you can still imagine the roar of the crowd, the clank of armor, the scream of a man facing a lion, the silence that came just before a final blow. The Colosseum was designed to make memories unforgettable, emotional, and often terrifying ones. Even though it's quiet now, the echoes are still there. Because when you build a stage big enough for 50,000 people, and you fill it with fire, swords, animals, and politics, you're not aiming for subtle. You're aiming for legend. And the Romans got exactly that. Their shows weren't fair, they weren't kind, but they were powerful. And the legacy of the Colosseum proves that sometimes, the most brutal stories are the ones people remember the longest. As the Roman Empire began to crumble, the games at the Colosseum didn't stop all at once. They slowed down gradually, like a fire running out of wood. The huge festivals became rare. The famous gladiators faded away. The animals stopped arriving from faraway lands. Bit by bit, the blood-soaked sand grew quiet. The turning point came when Rome began to change its values. Christianity was spreading fast, and the new religion didn't support violence as entertainment. Early Christian leaders criticized the games, calling them brutal and immoral. They said killing people for sport was wrong, not just for the victims, but for the audience. 2.s more Romans converted to Christianity. The crowds at the Colosseum began to shrink. The cheers faded. The bloodshed lost its charm. Over time, emperors stopped funding the games. The state had bigger problems like invasions, rebellions, and money troubles. The last recorded gladiator fights happened around 404 AD. Animal hunts lasted a little longer, but they too eventually ended. The Colosseum was still there, of course, but without the games, it became a shell of what it once was. Over the centuries, it was looted for stone, damaged by earthquakes, and used for everything from housing to a fortress. But it never truly disappeared. Its giant arches and towering walls remained a quiet reminder of the noise and chaos it once held. Even as the world changed, the legacy of the games remained. People never forgot the stories, the brave gladiators, the roaring lions, the dramatic escapes. They were passed down for generations. Artists painted them, writers described them, and eventually, filmmakers turned them into movies. But behind all the drama and heroism, there's a darker truth. The games weren't just entertainment. They were a mirror. They showed Rome's hunger for power, its love of control, and how far it would go to keep people entertained and distracted. That's what made the Colosseum so powerful. It wasn't just a building. It was an idea. It said, we can turn violence into applause. We can turn pain into politics. We can control everything, even life and death, if we put it on a stage. And the scary part, it worked. People cheered while others suffered. They laughed at pain. They voted on who lived or died like it was a game. That's not just about Rome, that's about human nature. The Colosseum didn't invent cruelty. It just made it fun to watch. And that's why its story still matters today. Even now, when we watch movies or play video games filled with battles and blood, we're not that far from the Roman crowd. We love drama. We love competition. We love stories where the stakes are life and death. The Colosseum may be ancient, but the emotions it created, excitement, fear, rage, joy, are still with us. That's why people still visit the ruins today. Not just to see the stone or take photos, but to feel something. To stand in the place where thousands once screamed for survival. To imagine the moment before the gate opened and a man stepped into the arena, not knowing if he'd leave it alive. The Colosseum teaches us something important. What we choose to watch says a lot about us. Rome watched blood. It made heroes out of fighters and monsters out of the crowd. It turned real people into characters, then threw them away when the story ended. That's the danger of turning life into a show, but it also shows us how creative people can be, even when that creativity is used in terrifying ways. The engineering, the planning, the performances, all of it required genius. The Colosseum was a masterpiece of design and storytelling. Just a very dark one. In a strange way, the Colosseum gave people power, too. The crowd could decide fates. The fighters could become legends. Even the condemned could win sympathy. It wasn't a fair system, but it was one where voices mattered, even if those voices were screaming in a blood-stained stadium. The stories from the Colosseum aren't just history. They're warnings. They remind us what happens when cruelty becomes normal, when the crowd forgets the cost of the show, and when power is used to entertain instead of to protect. And yet, the Colosseum stands. It's still there, thousands of years later. Not because it was beautiful, though it was. Not because it was useful, though it used to be. But because it tells a story the world can't forget. The story of a city that ruled the world and chose to rule with fire, steel, and spectacle. The story of an arena where people became heroes, villains, and victims, often all at once. And the story of us, how we watch, how we cheer, and how easily we can forget that behind every show, there's a real person at the center of it. So next time you hear about the Roman Colosseum, don't just picture swords and lions. Picture the people in the seats, the ones laughing, shouting, pointing their thumbs. Because in the end, the Colosseum wasn't made of stone. It was made of people.